New Year's Eve has always been a time for celebration. Fireworks lighting up the sky, champagne glasses clinking, and the countdown to midnight filling the air with anticipation. But last year, my New Year's Eve was different. It was the night I realized some doors should never be opened, no matter how curious you are. I had been invited to a cabin in the woods by an old friend, Mark. He'd recently bought the place, a fixer-upper nestled deep in the forest, far from the noise of the city. Mark had always been adventurous, the kind of guy who thrived on mystery and challenge. "Come on," he'd said over the phone. "What better way to kick off the new year than a little wilderness retreat?" I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but Mark was persistent. By the time I arrived on the 31st, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in hues of blood red and orange. The cabin was as rustic as they come, wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and an eerie creak in every floorboard. Yet something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed too deep, or the oppressive silence that swallowed up the forest outside. "Glad you made it," Mark greeted me with a grin, handing me a glass of whiskey. He wasn't alone. Two other friends, Sarah and Kyle, were already there. They looked uneasy, exchanging glances as if they'd seen something they couldn't explain. "Don't mind them," Mark joked, noticing my raised eyebrow. "They're just spooked because of the stories." "Stories?" I asked, taking a sip of the drink. "Local legends," Mark said with a dismissive wave. "Apparently this land used to belong to some reclusive family. They were into weird stuff, rituals, summoning spirits, that sort of thing. People say you can still hear whispers in the woods at night." I laughed it off, but Sarah's face was pale. "It's not just stories," she whispered. "Last night I heard something outside my window. It wasn't an animal. Probably just the wind," Mark said, brushing it aside. "Anyway, let's not ruin the night with ghost tales. It's New Year's Eve. Let's celebrate." As the evening wore on, we drank, played cards, and tried to shake off the strange tension hanging in the air. Midnight was approaching when Mark suggested we explore the cellar. "Come on," he urged, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Let's see what's down there." I hesitated. The idea of venturing into a dark, musty basement in a place already giving me the creeps didn't sit well. But Mark was persuasive, and soon, all four of us were descending the narrow staircase. The cellar was cold, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Mark's flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing old tools, broken furniture, and a peculiar door at the far end. It was made of heavy wood, reinforced with iron bands, and had a large padlock hanging from it. "What do you think's behind it?" Kyle asked, his voice low. "Only one way to find out," Mark said, pulling out a crowbar. "Mark, don't," Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling. "This is a bad idea." But Mark was already prying the lock. With a loud snap, it broke free, and the door creaked open. A wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor. Inside was a small, dark room, its walls lined with strange symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room was a low altar, stained dark with something that looked unsettlingly like dried blood. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, my stomach turning. Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. The flashlight flickered, plunging us into near darkness. And then we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls. Sarah screamed, and I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. Spinning around, there was nothing there, but the air felt alive, pulsing with something unseen. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But when we turned to the door, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the air itself was holding it shut. "Mark, what the hell did you do?" Kyle shouted, panic rising in his voice. "I didn't do anything," Mark yelled back. But his bravado was gone, replaced with genuine fear. The growling grew louder, joined by whispers that seemed to come from every direction. They weren't in English, or any language I'd ever heard, but they filled my head, making it hard to think. I backed away from the altar, only to feel something soft and wet beneath my foot. Looking down, I saw the ground was slick with fresh blood, seeping up from the floor like water from a spring. "Help me!" Sarah screamed. She was being dragged toward the altar by something invisible, her nails scraping against the stone floor. Kyle and I lunged forward, grabbing her arms, but whatever had hold of her was strong, too strong. "Let her go!" I shouted, yanking with all my strength. With a final pull, we freed her, and she collapsed into our arms, sobbing. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the air became unbearably cold. I could see my breath, even as sweat dripped down my face. "The symbols," Mark said suddenly, pointing at the walls. "Maybe they're a way to stop it." Desperation took over as we scrambled to trace the carvings with our fingers, hoping against hope that we could somehow undo whatever we'd unleashed. As I pressed my hand against one of the symbols, a searing pain shot through me, but the whispers faltered for a moment. It was enough to give us a sliver of hope. One by one, we traced the symbols, enduring the pain that came with each touch. The growling subsided, replaced by an ear-splitting scream that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The door creaked open, and the oppressive air lifted. We didn't wait to find out what would happen next. Grabbing Sarah, we bolted up the stairs and out of the cabin, leaving everything behind. By the time we reached the car, none of us could speak. We drove in silence, the only sound the crunch of snow under the tires. I haven't spoken to Mark, Sarah, or Kyle since that night. None of us ever returned to the cabin, and as far as I know, it still stands, waiting for its next unsuspecting visitors. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers, faint and fleeting, and I wonder if we really escaped, or if a part of us is still trapped in that cellar, doomed to replay that horrifying New Year's Eve forever. New Year's Eve has always been my favorite night of the year. The air buzzes with an electricity unlike any other day, a collective thrill for fresh starts and promises unkept. This year, though, was different. It's the year I'll never forget. The year I wish I could erase from my memory. I had planned a quiet night with a couple of close friends at my cabin in the woods, far from the chaos of the city. The cabin was a family heirloom, tucked away in a remote area of Vermont. The sort of place where your phone is more likely to lose signal than find it. My friends, Sam and Greg, were thrilled at the idea of escaping civilization for a night of laughter, drinks, and fireworks. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the snow-covered trees in hues of orange and purple. Inside the cabin, we lit a fire and settled in, our voices echoing off the wooden walls. Greg found an old record player, and soon the scratchy notes of some forgotten jazz album filled the room. It was perfect, at least at first. It began innocently enough. A knock on the door. "Did you invite anyone else?" Sam asked, raising an eyebrow. I shook my head. "We're miles from anyone. Who'd even bother coming out here?" Greg stood, brushing the crumbs of his sandwich off his lap. "I'll get it." He opened the door to nothing but the icy wind. No one was there. "Weird," Greg said, closing the door and locking it for good measure. "Probably just the wind banging on the shutters or something." We laughed it off, but unease settled in the room. To shake it, we cranked up the music and poured another round of drinks. Midnight was still hours away, and we weren't about to let a little spookiness ruin our night. But the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Greg jumped up again, but I stopped him. "Let me. Maybe it's a prank or, I don't know, an animal?" When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was the snow. Pristine and untouched. Not a single footprint leading to the cabin. Not even ours anymore. The snowstorm had wiped them clean. The second thing I noticed was a small package on the doorstep, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. I brought it inside and we gathered around the kitchen table, staring at it like it might explode. "Open it," Greg urged. "What if it's—" Sam trailed off, her voice uneasy. "You know, something dangerous?" "Like a bomb?" Greg scoffed. "Come on, it's probably just a gag gift from one of the neighbors." "We don't have neighbors," I reminded him, but curiosity got the better of me. I untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. The picture was of us. The three of us, sitting on the couch in front of the fire. But the picture wasn't taken earlier that evening. In the photo, we weren't smiling or holding drinks. We weren't even looking at the camera. Instead, our faces were twisted in terror, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with fear. Behind us stood a dark figure, its face obscured, its hand outstretched toward me. I dropped the photo like it burned. What the hell? This isn't funny, Sam said, her voice shaking. If one of you is playing a prank, I swear. It's not a prank, I snapped. How could it be? Greg picked up the photo, squinting at it. This is messed up. Who took this? How? None of us had an answer. The room fell silent, the crackling of the fire suddenly ominous. That's when we heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. No one's up there, I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. We're all down here, Sam said, clutching Greg's arm. Aren't we? Stay here, I said, grabbing the fireplace poker. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own voice. I'll check it out. Greg started to argue, but I was already halfway up the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. When I reached the landing, the hallway stretched before me, dark and uninviting. The door to the master bedroom was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. I pushed the door open, poker raised, ready to swing. The room was empty. At least that's what I thought until I turned toward the bed. Lying there was another Polaroid, face down on the pillow. My hand trembled as I picked it up and flipped it over. It was another photo of us. This time, we were standing in the kitchen, staring at the first Polaroid. The same dark figure loomed behind us, closer now, its face still hidden. I backed out of the room, my breath coming in short gasps. When I returned to the living room, Sam and Greg were gone. The cabin was silent. The fire had burned down to embers, and the record player had stopped. On the couch was a third Polaroid. This one showed me, standing alone in the living room, holding the second photo. The dark figure was right behind me, its hand resting on my shoulder. I spun around, swinging the poker wildly, but there was nothing there. The clock struck midnight. Fireworks exploded in the distance, their colors painting the windows in bursts of red, blue, and green. I was alone, completely and utterly alone. Or so I thought. Somewhere outside, a knock echoed through the cold night. Louder this time, more insistent. And then, the door creaked open. I've never been the type to buy into New Year's Eve superstitions. You know, the ones about how your first moments of the year set the tone for the rest of it. But after what happened to me last year, I've started to believe those warnings might hold some truth, and a darker truth than anyone realizes. It started like any other New Year's Eve. I'd been invited to a party at a friend's cabin deep in the woods. It was a 2-hour drive from the city, but the promise of good company, a roaring fireplace, and an escape from the usual overcrowded bars seemed worth it. The invitation had been last minute. I didn't know most of the guests, but my friend Mark assured me it would be a night to remember. Mark had always had a thing for theatrics, so I wasn't surprised when he told me to bring a flashlight and something warm. The cabin's a bit off the beaten path, he'd said, laughing. Don't worry, it'll be worth it. I arrived just before 10 p.m. The air was biting cold, and the road leading to the cabin was shrouded in dense fog. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, its windows glowing with the warm light of candles and string lights. Inside, the atmosphere was lively, a group of about 10 people all chatting and laughing. Mark greeted me with a drink and introduced me to the others. Everyone seemed friendly, if not a little off. There was something peculiar about their smiles, their lingering gazes. I chalked it up to being an outsider in a close-knit group. As the night wore on, the mood began to shift. Around 11:30, Mark clinked a spoon against his glass to get everyone's attention. All right, folks, he announced, it's time for the main event. Main event? I didn't remember hearing anything about a main event. But the others seemed to know what he meant. They all exchanged knowing looks and moved to the large wooden table in the center of the room. Mark gestured for me to follow. On the table lay a box. It was old, its surface scarred with deep scratches and strange symbols. Mark opened it carefully, revealing a deck of cards. They weren't like any playing cards I'd ever seen. Each one bore unsettling hand-drawn images, shadowy figures, twisted trees, and things I couldn't quite make out but made my stomach churn. "This," Mark said with a grin, "is the game." "What kind of game?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "A New Year's tradition," one of the others replied. Her name was Lisa, and her voice had a melodic quality that didn't match the unsettling gleam in her eyes. "You draw a card and it shows you what's in store for the year ahead." "It's just for fun," Mark added, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Think of it like a fortune-telling game." I'm not superstitious, but something about those cards made my skin crawl. Still, I didn't want to be the only one refusing to play. Everyone else was eager, even giddy. The first few rounds were uneventful. Lisa drew a card showing a sunlit meadow, and everyone cheered, saying it meant prosperity. Another guy drew a card with a stormy sea, and they joked about him having a turbulent year. Then it was my turn. I hesitated before reaching for the deck. My hand hovered over the cards, and for a moment I thought about walking away. But the room was silent, and all eyes were on me. I took a deep breath and drew a card. The image was simple but chilling. A dark figure standing at the edge of a forest, its face obscured. Its hand was extended, as if beckoning. Below it, in looping script, were the words, "The Watcher." The room went quiet. Too quiet. Everyone stared at the card, their expressions unreadable. Mark's usual grin faltered. "What does it mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. Finally, Lisa spoke. "It's just a game," she said, though she wouldn't meet my eyes. "Don't overthink it." But the tension in the room was palpable. I tried to shake it off, laughing nervously as I placed the card back in the deck. The party resumed, but the energy had shifted. I caught whispers, sideways glances, and once I could have sworn I saw Mark and Lisa arguing in hushed tones. By the time midnight approached, I was ready to leave. The others gathered outside to watch the fireworks, but I lingered by the door, contemplating my exit. That's when I heard it. A knock. Soft, deliberate, and coming from the back door. I froze. The others were still outside, their laughter echoing through the trees. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. The knock came again, louder this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. My flashlight was in my jacket pocket and I fumbled to turn it on. With the beam cutting through the dark, I approached the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. I swung the door open, and my flashlight illuminated the empty forest. No tracks in the snow, no sign of anyone. Just the skeletal trees swaying in the wind. And then I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, a figure. Tall, motionless, and watching. The same figure from the card. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart pounding. "Mark!" I shouted, but the cabin was empty. The others hadn't come back inside. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the front door, not caring about goodbyes. The drive back to the city was a blur of panic and paranoia. Every shadow on the road seemed to shift. Every gust of wind felt like it carried whispers. I never heard from Mark or the others again. The cabin's phone number was disconnected, and no one else seemed to know who they were. Sometimes I wonder if any of it was real. But then, on quiet nights, I hear it. A soft, deliberate knock at my window, even on the 12th floor of my apartment. And I know the Watcher is still there.